Back on the Evolution World of Sacred Device episode, I discussed how I had extremely little experience with turn-based Japanese-style role-playing games, but that game, while considered a fairly middle-of-the-road entry in the genre, allowed me to finally at least get into the style and understand the appeal of the structure, and that I would always have a place in my heart for it because it was first. Well, it established in my mind enough of the tropes and experiences of the genre that I had at least had a vague expectation of what should and would work and not work in this realm. And in the experiential classification of release a kinda bad dungeon crawler RPG on the Dreamcast to middling dismissed critical effect, Climax Entertainment's Time Stalkers just doesn't have the same juice. Climax Entertainment is the main development hub of offshoot Climax Graphics, the studio responsible for the baffling, demented survival horror game Blue Stinger. That game featured a bemusingly sassy, inexplicably dickish protagonist thrust into a strange situation who the game expected you to find charming. Similarly, Time Stalkers tells the story of a young man named Sword, who is, spoiler alert, a swordsman, who follows an assailant into a clock tower, loses him inside a library, flips through a random book, gets knocked unconscious, and is transported to a floating landmass pieced together from different worlds and time periods. He meets an old man named Master that declares Sword the Chosen One, and Sword finds himself trawling a series of dungeons while having vague, confusing conversations with everyone he meets. There becomes a narrative reason for this, but the difference here is, while Blue Stinger expected you to find Elliot's weird lover boy dialogue endearing, Sword is such a standoffish prick that even in canon, everyone he interacts with is like, wow, what a little asshole this kid is. Evolution's protagonist, Mag Launcher, had his sassy anime retorts as well, but generally he was just like a nice kid doing his best. Sword, in every dialogue sequence, elicits "this fucking guy" responses every time he talks. The other thing to discuss about Time Stalkers is the meat of the game, the dungeon crawling. I am still an absolute newbie to these sorts of turn-based RPGs, but I found the combat here really uninspiring. Evolution's combat was repetitive too, but that seems to be the nature of the beast, and it was also really punchy and easy to understand. Here, there's not much style, there's no real animations, and not a lot of intriguing options for combat. There's definitely a chance it's just too complex for me, or that I have to build up to the real interesting choices, but I played for a good while, and it never got more engaging or interesting. And I found myself just glumly clicking buttons over and over. It never felt like an appealing proposition. Even more befuddling, the game has a typical RPG level-up system, but at the beginning of each dungeon, your level resets to 1 every time. You lose absolutely all progress the moment you leave each dungeon, and have to start from the absolute bottom with basic attacks every time you go to a new location, which also makes it hard to keep interested in the escalation when it's so repetitive. I was like, what the hell? But thought maybe that's a typical procedure of the dungeon crawler genre. Looking up the critical response, it appears, nope, as reviewer after reviewer from the time cited it as a perplexing decision, one that engendered frustration and nihilism about the whole enterprise. It honestly almost qualifies as an early example of the roguelike genre, but the pacing and combat was so hard to get interested in that I found it a hindrance instead of an interest. From a macro level, the narrative structure of the game is fairly interesting. As the story progresses, it seems to be that the man who identified himself as Master is actually some sort of powerful being who created a living world called Ring World for his own storytelling, pulling from a lot of different universes. Climax uses the opportunity to bring back a bunch of characters from their own, mostly Japanese-only RPG releases, including Pyra from Genesis dungeon crawler Shining in the Darkness, protagonist Nigel from Sega cult classic Landstalker, the titular lady from Lady Stalker, and Rao, who is implied to be from the world of Shining sister series Feda, the Emblem of Justice. There's a lot of intriguing meta-textual stuff about Master projecting remotely into his created world and having to circumvent the expected conclusion of the story by thinking outside the box creatively. And there's a lot of deliberate storytelling dead ends because the characters themselves are trying to outmaneuver the storyteller himself, as all of them are eager to not be cast as the heroes of the Ring world and are trying to escape. The problem is simply that it just felt like such a lengthy slog to play through, to arrive at the more interesting narrative beats. Again, I could be speaking completely out of turn, as I have so little RPG experience, and about as much roguelike experience, with the very fluid, combat-focused contemporary release Hades being the only one I've really spent much time with. So I'm trying not to shit on this too much, just because I just lack the experience to truly judge it in depth. I felt validated by all of the period reviews, but sometimes things prove to be too new, too Japanese, too far ahead of their time, as evidenced by the hostile response that something like Tokyo Extreme Racer received on initial release. And so, if you have a lot of experience with these sorts of games, and this looks like your jam, maybe it is. Maybe I'm just speaking from limited experience. But this is my story, damn it. And I'm telling you how I feel about every one of these Dreamcast games. And Time Stalkers very quickly became something I dreaded having to come back to and put more time in. So if you get to the end, maybe you can tell me if it finishes with any sort of cool flourish. Because as far as I go, this is my station. This is where I get off. Next time... Oh my god, so random, you guys!